right. Welcome to the Global Challenge 213, 216, the next 4 years. Right use of time, right use of mind. I'm Clarity Ross, helping facilitate the right use of time, right use of mind, which is actually to use a very, very profound use of affirmations. And this is the third video. We started out, the first one introduced a very basic root affirmation. The second one helped expand it into using plurality with your affirmations. And this third one is going to introduce more abstract use of it. So the first one, to recapitulate, said this tree can't teach the ego anything. This tree doesn't need to be this tree. Instead of this tree, oneness is seen. The second video said these trees can't teach the ego anything. These trees don't need to be these trees. Instead of these trees, oneness is seen. Now we're going to introduce something slightly more abstract. This day can't teach the ego anything. This day doesn't need to be this day. Instead of this day, oneness is seen. And now we're going to expand that. This month, this week, let's try it. This week can't teach the ego anything. This week doesn't need to be this week. Instead of this week, oneness is seen. This month can't teach the ego anything. This month doesn't need to be this month. Instead of this month, oneness is seen. This year can't teach the ego anything. This year doesn't need to be this year. Instead of this year, oneness is seen. This decade can't teach the ego anything. This decade doesn't need to be this decade. Instead of this decade, oneness is seen. This century cannot teach the ego anything. This century doesn't need to be this century. Instead of this century, oneness is seen. This millennium cannot teach the ego anything. This millennium doesn't need to be this millennium. Instead of this millennium, oneness is seen. Okay, let's practice that. You see how we're expanding the affirmation here. Expanding. So this is a wonderful feeling like, hey, there's a lot of power to this, isn't there? There really is. So let's start off with this minute. Let's try that, and we'll just run through the expansion. Just go along here. This minute can't teach the ego anything. This minute doesn't need to be this minute. Instead of this minute, oneness is seen. This hour can't teach the ego anything. This hour doesn't need to be this hour. Instead of this hour, oneness is seen. This day can't teach the ego anything. This day doesn't need to be this day. Instead of this day, oneness is seen. This week can't teach the ego anything. This week doesn't need to be this week. Instead of this week, oneness is seen. This month can't teach the ego anything. This month doesn't need to be this month. Instead of this month, oneness is seen. This year can't teach the ego anything. This year doesn't need to be this year. Instead of this year, oneness is seen. This decade can't teach the ego anything. This decade doesn't need to be this decade. Instead of this decade, oneness is seen. This century can't teach the ego anything. Instead of this century doesn't need to be this century. Instead of this century, oneness is seen. This millennium can't teach the ego anything. This millennium doesn't need to be this millennium. Instead of this millennium, oneness is seen. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to try this on your own. I'll start it out, and then you I'll call out I'll call out like minute, and then you do the minute. Then I'll call out the hour, and you do the hour. Okay. So I'm gonna turn the light on here. You're gonna do this, and I'll call out the minute. Okay. This minute. This hour. This day. this week, this month, this year, this decade, this century, this millennium, all right, so let's go over it one more time. Just go over it with me here. We'll start out with this second. This second can't teach the ego anything. This second doesn't need to be the second. Instead of the second, oneness is seen. This minute can't teach the ego anything. This minute doesn't need to be this minute. Instead of this minute, oneness is seen. This hour can't teach the ego anything. This hour doesn't need to be this hour. Instead of this hour, oneness is seen. This day can't teach the ego anything. This day doesn't need to be this day. Instead of this day, oneness is seen. This week can't teach the ego anything. This week doesn't need to be this week. Instead of this week, oneness is seen. This month can't teach the ego anything. This month doesn't need to be this month. Instead of this month, oneness is seen. This year can't teach the ego anything. This year doesn't need to be this year. Instead of this year, oneness is seen. This decade can't teach the ego anything. This decade doesn't need to be this decade. Instead of this decade, oneness is seen. This century can't teach the ego anything. This century doesn't need to be this century. Instead of this century, oneness is seen. This millennia cannot teach the ego anything. This millennia does not need to be this millennia. Instead of this millennia, oneness can be seen. All right. So that you see how you can climb the ladder into generalization. We can do it with people. Let's try it with people now. Let's start practicing with different stuff. This person cannot teach the ego anything. This person doesn't need to be this person. Instead of this person, oneness is seen. That couple cannot teach the ego anything. That couple doesn't need to be that couple. Instead of that couple, oneness is seen. That group can't teach the ego anything. That group doesn't need to be that group. Instead of that group, oneness is seen. That bunch can't teach the ego anything. Instead of that bunch doesn't need to be that bunch. Instead of that bunch, oneness is seen. That crowd can't teach the ego anything. That crowd doesn't need to be that crowd. Instead of that crowd, oneness is seen. That population can't teach the ego anything. That population doesn't need to be that population. Instead of that population, oneness can be seen. All the people in the world can't teach the ego anything. All the people in the world don't need to be all the people in the world. Instead of all the people in the world, oneness can be seen. So there you go. That's an example. This tree can't teach the ego anything. This tree doesn't need to be this tree. Instead of this tree, oneness can be seen. Oneness is seen. Oneness is seen. Those trees can't teach the ego anything. Those trees don't need to be those trees. Instead of those trees, oneness is seen. Is seen. That grove of trees can't teach the ego anything. That grove of trees doesn't need to be that grove of trees. Instead of that grove of trees, oneness is seen. That hillside of trees can't teach the ego anything. That hillside of trees doesn't need to be that hillside of trees. Instead of that hillside of trees, oneness is seen. That forest can't teach the ego anything. That forest of trees, let's say, that forest of trees can't teach the ego anything. That forest of trees doesn't need to be that forest of trees. Instead of that forest of trees, oneness is seen. The trees of this planet cannot teach the ego anything. The trees of this planet don't need to be the trees of this planet. Instead of the trees of this planet, oneness is seen. And then you can say, the trees in the universe can't teach, all the trees in the universe can't teach the ego anything. All the trees in the universe don't need to be all the trees in the universe. Instead of all the trees in the universe, oneness is seen. Okay. So in this video, we've used both climbing the ladder, expanding it, climbing the ladder, and more abstract. Let's see if we can get something more abstract. A little more abstract, yes. Something that near and dear to us. Okay. Something abstract would be like sickness. This sickness can't teach the ego anything. Or this cancer can't teach the ego anything. This cancer doesn't need to be this cancer. Instead of this cancer, oneness is seen. And then you can climb the ladder on that. These cancers can't teach the ego anything. These cancers don't need to be these cancers. Instead of these cancers, oneness is seen. And you can go from specific, this cancer, to those cancers, and all cancers then. Say, all cancers can't teach the ego anything. All cancers don't need to be all cancers. Instead of all cancers, oneness is seen. And then you can go to another specific. For instance, diabetes. Diabetes can't teach the ego anything. Diabetes doesn't need to be diabetes. Instead of diabetes, oneness is seen. Or you can say that diabetes. Then you go, that diabetes, or my diabetes, that diabetes. Start out with that specific. Start with specific. That diabetes doesn't need to be that can't teach the ego anything. That diabetes doesn't need to be that diabetes. Instead of that diabetes, oneness is seen. Then those diabetes, the diabetes in this area, or in this hospital, diabetes in this hospital can't teach the ego anything. The diabetes in this hospital doesn't need to be diabetes in this hospital. Instead of all the diabetes in this hospital, oneness is seen. Then you can expand it. All the diabetes on this planet can't teach the ego anything. All the cases of diabetes on this planet can't teach the ego anything. All the cases of diabetes on this planet don't need to be all the cases of diabetes on this planet. Instead of all the cases of diabetes on this planet, oneness is seen. Okay, so we're getting into more advanced use of affirmation, and you can get the taste of what's going on here. You say, hey, wait a minute, wow. This is pretty profound, isn't it? It is. It is very profound. It's like a piano. There's certain notes, and you can play C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And so simple notes, and then you can hit simple chords, and then you can get more and more start playing more and more beautiful music on the piano. So, something more abstract, again. Anger. My anger cannot teach the ego anything. My anger doesn't need to be my anger. Instead of my anger, oneness is seen. Our anger can't teach the ego anything. Our anger doesn't need to be our anger. Instead of our anger, oneness is seen. A group of people, or some protesters, a group of protesters. This anger can't teach the ego anything. This anger doesn't need to be this anger. Instead of this anger, oneness is seen. A war. Okay, let's expand it from a protest movement to a revolution. A revolution. All this anger can't teach the ego anything. All this anger doesn't need to be all this anger. Instead of all this anger, oneness is seen. And then to the most abstract, we'll just use the term anger in this abstract way. Not anyone in particular, just anger. We'll say, anger can't teach the ego anything. Anger doesn't need to be anger. Instead of anger, oneness is seen. Let's try that again. So we went from specific to the abstract, completely abstract, right, which covers all forms of anger. Start out with the specific. My anger, our anger, this anger, that anger, this large anger, and then just anger. So let's try one more. Anger again, the abstract. Anger cannot teach the ego anything. Anger doesn't need to be anger. Instead of anger, oneness is seen. All right, that's abstract. Now let's do another abstraction. Remember, we did the time, this hour, this day, that kind of thing. How about, here's an abstraction on that. But we start at second, hour, second, minute, hour, day, week, month, year, decade, century, millennium, okay? So at the end we say this millennium can't teach the ego anything. This millennium need not be this millennium. Instead of this millennium, oneness is seen. Now let's go to the abstract. Time cannot teach the ego anything. Time doesn't need to be time. Instead of time, oneness is seen. Okay? See, this is the big one, isn't it? You can feel that. It's like shifting gears, like, wow, wow. It's a new ballgame. I can really say that, of course. So work up. Go from the second to the minute, to the hour, to the day, to the week, to the month, to the year, to the decade, to the century, to the millennium, and then finally finish it off saying, time can't teach the ego anything. Time doesn't need to be time. Instead of time, oneness is seen. Okay, so now you're there. You're feeling like, hey, I can arrive. I can arrive. Absolutely, I can arrive. But it's very important to practice the specifics and the basics and the specifics first before we get to the absolute statements. Okay, in the next video we'll practice more absolute statements. All right, okay, very great. See you in the next video.